Imagine a world where the very foundations of religion and belief are being shaken to their core. This was the reality of the early modern era, a time when the old certainties of the Catholic Church were challenged, and new ideas began to reshape the way people thought about God, salvation, and the meaning of life. This was the age of the Reformation, a time of dramatic change that would lead to the rise of Protestantism and eventually to what we now call Reformed Orthodoxy. The Reformation didn't just happen overnight. It was a long, complex process that spanned nearly 2 centuries, from the early 1500s to the late 1600s. During this time, the religious landscape of Europe was transformed and new forms of Christianity emerged, each with its own distinct beliefs and practices. At the heart of this transformation was the Reformed tradition, a movement that traced its roots back to the teachings of John Calvin, a French theologian who became one of the most influential figures of the Reformation. But the story of the Reformed tradition is not just the story of Calvin. It's a story of many voices, many ideas, and many debates. It's a story of how a diverse group of thinkers and believers came together to form a new way of understanding the Christian faith. And it's a story that challenges many of the assumptions we might have about the Reformation and its legacy. When we think of the Reformation, we often imagine a clear and straightforward narrative. We might think of Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, or of John Calvin writing his Institutes of the Christian Religion. But the reality is far more complex. The Reformation was a messy, contentious, and often violent period. It was a time when old ideas were being questioned and new ideas were being tested. It was a time when people were struggling to make sense of a world that was changing faster than they could keep up with. One of the biggest challenges in understanding the Reformation is the way it has been told and retold over the years. Many of the stories we hear about the Reformation are what historians call master narratives. These are simplified, often overly dramatic accounts that try to explain the entire Reformation in a few key events or figures. But these narratives can be misleading. They often ignore the diversity and complexity of the Reformation, reducing it to a few simple ideas or a single person's influence. For example, many people think of the Reformed tradition as being founded by John Calvin and his followers, but this is only part of the story. Calvin's ideas were important, but they were not the only ideas that shaped the Reformed tradition. There were many other thinkers and theologians who contributed to the development of Reformed thought, each bringing their own unique perspectives and insights. Some of these thinkers agreed with Calvin on certain points, while others disagreed or offered alternative interpretations. Another challenge is the way the Reformation has been understood in relation to the broader context of early modern Europe. The Reformation didn't happen in a vacuum. It was part of a larger cultural and intellectual movement that was transforming Europe in many ways. The Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, and the rise of nation-states were all happening at the same time as the Reformation, and they all had an impact on how people thought about religion and theology. So, when we talk about the Reformation and the development of the Reformed tradition, we need to be careful. We need to look beyond the simple narratives and the familiar figures to see the full complexity of what was happening. We need to understand the Reformation as a dynamic, evolving process, one that was shaped by many different factors and influenced by a wide range of thinkers and ideas. This book is an attempt to do just that. It's a journey through the early modern era, exploring the development of the Reformed tradition from the time of Calvin to the era of Orthodoxy. We'll look at the debates, the ideas, and the people who shaped this tradition, and we'll try to understand how it evolved over time. We'll see that the Reformed tradition was not a monolithic, unchanging system of beliefs, but a diverse and dynamic movement that was constantly adapting and evolving. As we begin this journey, we'll start by examining the Reformation itself, looking at the key figures and events that set the stage for the development of the Reformed tradition. We'll then explore the early years of Reformed Orthodoxy, when the ideas of the Reformation were being systematized and codified into a more formal theological framework. Along the way, we'll encounter some of the most important thinkers of the Reformed tradition, from John Calvin to Theodore Beza, and we'll see how their ideas influenced the development of Reformed thought. But we won't just focus on the big names. We'll also look at the lesser-known figures and the debates that often get overlooked in the standard narratives. We'll see that the Reformed tradition was a rich and varied movement, one that was shaped by a wide range of influences and ideas. And we'll see that the story of the Reformed tradition is a story of ongoing debate and dialogue, a story of people trying to make sense of their faith in a rapidly changing world. So let's begin our journey. Let's dive into the world of the Reformation and the early modern era and explore the fascinating story of the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition, often called Calvinism, is a rich and complex part of Protestant history. To understand it, we need to look beyond just one person like John Calvin and see it as a broader movement shaped by many thinkers and their ideas. This approach helps us see how the Reformed tradition developed over time and how it was influenced by earlier thinkers and events. In the early days of the Reformation, there were many reformers who contributed to what would become the Reformed tradition. These reformers, including people like Huldrych, Zwingli, and Heinrich Bullinger, didn't just sit back and let Calvin do all the work. They wrote important documents and had their own ideas about theology. For example, Zwingli and Calvin had different views on some topics, but these differences didn't split the Reformed movement. Instead, they added to its richness and diversity. John T. McNeill, a historian, pointed out that even though Zwingli and Calvin had different ideas, they were still part of the same broader movement. He said that calling this movement Calvinism is a bit of a shorthand, but it's more accurate to call it Reformed because it includes a wide range of thinkers and ideas. Some people try to divide the Reformed tradition by focusing on small differences between thinkers. For example, they might say that Bullinger's ideas were different from Calvin's, or that Beza's theology was a deviation from Calvin's. But this approach misses the bigger picture. It's like trying to understand a whole forest by looking at just one tree. Each reformer had their own unique background and context, and their ideas were shaped by these factors. Instead of seeing these differences as splits, we should see them as part of the natural diversity within the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition didn't just appear overnight. It developed gradually over time, with many people contributing to its growth. This development can be divided into different periods such as the Reformation, 1517 to 1565, Early Orthodoxy, 1565 to 1640, and High Orthodoxy, 1640 to 1780. These periods are not clear-cut, and the Reformed tradition continued to evolve throughout each one. For example, the early Orthodox period saw the creation of important confessional documents, which helped shape the Reformed churches. These documents were written by different people in different contexts, but they all contributed to the overall development of the Reformed tradition. In recent years, historians have been reassessing the Reformation and the periods that followed. They've found that the old narratives, which often focused on a few great thinkers and ignored the broader context, were incomplete. These older narratives often saw the Reformation as a complete break from the Middle Ages, with the rise of humanism and the fall of scholasticism. But newer research shows that humanism and scholasticism were not opposed to each other. They were both methods of thinking that coexisted and influenced each other. For example, Martin Luther, one of the key figures of the Reformation, was influenced by late medieval nominalism and the Augustinian tradition. John Calvin, another important reformer, drew on a variety of medieval sources, including the works of Bernard of Clairvaux and medieval Scotism. These influences show that the Reformation was not a complete break from the past, but a continuation and transformation of earlier ideas. The Reformed tradition, therefore, is not just about one person or one book. It's about a community of thinkers who built on each other's ideas and developed a rich and diverse tradition. By understanding this broader context, we can better appreciate the complexity and depth of the Reformed tradition. Recent studies have shown that the Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin didn't just reject everything from the past. Instead, their ideas were a mix of old and new, combining elements from both humanistic and scholastic traditions. This means that while they criticized some aspects of medieval scholasticism, they also used some of its methods and vocabulary in their own writings. For example, when we look at Calvin's work, we see that he was trained in humanism, which focused on studying ancient texts and languages. However, his theology also shows clear signs of scholastic influence, which was more about logical argument and systematic thinking. Calvin didn't just throw out everything from the past. He picked and chose what he thought was useful. This mixing of methods wasn't unique to Calvin. Other reformers like Martin Bucer and Peter Martyr Vermigli also combined humanistic and scholastic elements in their work. They discussed and debated with each other, showing that no one person's ideas were seen as the ultimate authority. For instance, Bucer critiqued some parts of the Consensus Tigerinus, a document Calvin helped write, suggesting that it didn't clearly express certain ideas about Christ. Similarly, Calvin and Vermigli had a respectful relationship where they learned from each other. Even in the next generation of Reformed theologians, there was no single Calvinist orthodoxy. These theologians often rejected being called Calvinists and saw Calvin as one of many important figures in their tradition. They developed their ideas based on ongoing discussions and debates, drawing on a wide range of influences, including medieval and patristic sources. When historians try to tell the story of the Reformation, it's tempting to create a simple narrative where one person or idea is the central focus. However, this approach often misses the complexity and diversity of the Reformation. Instead, it's better to look at the actual sources and let the evidence speak for itself, without imposing modern assumptions or biases. One key point is that we need to understand scholasticism and humanism as methods, rather than as specific theologies or philosophies. Scholasticism was a way of organizing and presenting knowledge, often using logical arguments and systematic structures. Humanism, on the other hand, focused on studying ancient texts and languages to understand the past and improve society. Both methods were used by the Reformers, sometimes together, to develop their theological ideas. For example, the Calvin against the Calvinists narrative suggests that later Reformed theologians distorted Calvin's ideas by introducing scholastic methods. This narrative assumes that scholasticism is inherently bad and that it leads to rigid speculative theology. However, this is a misunderstanding. Scholastic methods were just tools, and they could be used to explore and express a wide range of theological ideas, not just rigid or speculative ones. In the early modern period, the relationship between humanism and scholasticism wasn't a simple opposition. They developed alongside each other, sometimes clashing, but often overlapping. The debates between humanists and scholastics changed over time, reflecting the evolving context and interests of the people involved. For instance, in the pre-Reformation era, the debates were often about the best methods for studying and interpreting ancient texts. During the Reformation, these debates became more complex as humanists and scholastics applied their methods to theological issues. In the end, the Reformers and their successors were not bound by a single method or a single set of ideas. They were part of a dynamic intellectual tradition that was constantly evolving and adapting. By recognizing this, we can better understand the rich and diverse nature of early modern Reformed thought. Calvin and his followers, like Theodore Beza, blended humanist and scholastic methods in their theological work. Calvin, for instance, used humanist training to analyze texts and scholastic methods to structure arguments. Beza, while known for his humanist skills in language and philology, also employed some scholastic techniques. By the time of the Amiraut controversy in the 17th century, most Reformed theologians were well versed in both humanist and scholastic methods. They would give academic speeches in the style of Cicero, a famous Roman orator, and also engage in detailed theological debates using scholastic techniques. This blend of methods showed that the earlier conflicts between humanists and scholastics had largely subsided, and both approaches were now part of a theologian's sukkot. When it comes to the relationship between method and content in scholasticism, it's important to understand that the method itself doesn't dictate specific doctrines. For example, using scholastic methods didn't automatically lead to a belief in predestination or a particular view of the covenant. Similarly, humanist methods didn't necessarily lead to a focus on covenant theology. It's a mistake to think that Calvin's views on predestination came from his scholastic training and his views on the covenant from his humanist training. The same goes for the broader Reformed tradition, where some theologians were seen as predestinarians and others as more humanistic and universalist. This kind of division is historically inaccurate. What the scholastic method did provide was a framework for organizing and arguing theological points. It required theologians to be well versed in a wide range of sources, including Scripture, the Church Fathers, medieval theologians, and contemporary philosophers. Scholastic works often included detailed arguments and counter-arguments, drawing on these sources to build a comprehensive understanding of a topic. The method didn't determine the specific doctrines or conclusions, but it did shape how those doctrines were presented and defended. One key aspect of scholastic method was the disputation, an academic exercise where a specific topic was debated. These disputations could be compiled into a set of theological topics, or loci. The loci method emphasized the integrity of each topic and the relationships between them, but it didn't allow for a deductive system where one doctrine logically led to another. This was different from later 19th century systematic theologies, which often tried to deduce all doctrines from a central dogma. The scholastic method also influenced the genre and audience of theological works. Scholastic works were typically aimed at an academic audience and were more detailed and argumentative. Catechetical works, on the other hand, were simpler and more practical, designed for teaching basic doctrines to a broader audience. The method didn't change the core doctrines, but it did affect how they were presented and organized. For example, the placement of predestination in Calvin's Institutes versus its placement in later Reformed works is often misunderstood. Calvin placed predestination in a more analytical a posteriori position, while later theologians often placed it in a more synthetic a priori position. This difference in placement is due to the method used, not a change in doctrine. The same doctrine could be presented differently based on the method and the intended audience. Scholastic method also involved the use of distinctions, such as the distinction between God's hidden will, voluntas arcana, and his revealed will, voluntas revelata. These distinctions added depth to theological discussions, but didn't dictate specific conclusions. For example, the distinction between the sufficiency and deficiency of Christ's satisfaction could be used by both Arminians and Reformed theologians to argue different points. While scholastic method became more prominent in academic settings, it didn't dominate all areas of Reformed theology. Catechesis and exegesis, for example, continued to use humanist and other methods. The rise of Protestant scholasticism didn't replace these methods, but coexisted with them. Theological content in commentaries, catechisms, and sermons remained interconnected with the more scholastic dogmatic works, showing a continuity in Reformed thought from the Reformation to the era of orthodoxy. Understanding the role of scholastic method in Reformed theology helps us appreciate the complexity and richness of this tradition. It shows that the methods used by theologians were tools to explore and express their beliefs, rather than rigid frameworks that determined their doctrines. The Mueller thesis is a term that has gained some traction in discussions about John Calvin and the development of Reformed theology. However, it's important to understand that this term is not something I or many other scholars have used in our work. The idea of a single overarching thesis that neatly explains the relationship between Calvin and later Reformed thinkers is overly simplistic and can lead to misunderstandings. When people talk about the Mueller thesis, they often reduce the complex history of Reformed theology to a simple argument about continuity or discontinuity between Calvin and the later Reformed Orthodox. Some argue that there is a direct and unbroken line from Calvin to later Reformed thinkers, while others emphasize the differences and changes that occurred over time. Both sides of this debate often miss the point by oversimplifying the rich and diverse history of Reformed thought. The real story is more nuanced. Reformed theology did not develop in a straight line from Calvin to later thinkers. Instead, it evolved through a series of debates, reformulations, and adaptations to changing contexts. Different Reformed theologians in different places and times interpreted Calvin's ideas in various ways, sometimes agreeing with him and sometimes diverging from his views. For example, Calvin was part of the second generation of reformers, which means he built upon the ideas of the first generation. He was a systematizer and organizer, not the originator of Reformed thought. This is an important point because it helps us understand that Calvin's ideas were part of a broader movement and not just the work of a single genius. Other scholars, such as Reinhold, Seeberg, George Park Fisher, and Williston Walker, have also noted this aspect of Calvin's role in the Reformation. Moreover, the Reformed tradition is not monolithic. It is diverse and has always been shaped by multiple influences, including different cultural and intellectual contexts. Reformed theologians in the 17th century, for instance, were influenced by both scholastic and humanist methods. These methods affected how they approached theological questions, but they did not determine the content of their theology. This is a point that has been well established by many historians of medieval and Renaissance learning. Another key aspect of Reformed theology is its confessional nature. The Reformed tradition is defined by its confessional documents, which set boundaries for what is considered orthodox. These documents were influenced by Calvin and his contemporaries, but they also evolved over time. The Puritans, for example, did not see Calvin as the sole authority, but rather as one of many important voices in their tradition. When we look at Reformed theology, we need to avoid the temptation to isolate Calvin from his historical context. Doing so can lead to a distorted view of his thought and its place in the Reformed tradition. Calvin's ideas were part of a larger conversation within the Church, and they were influenced by the same confessional norms that guided later Reformed theologians. Unfortunately, some modern theologians have used a decontextualized version of Calvin to support their own theological agendas. They might highlight certain aspects of Calvin's thought while ignoring others, or they might use Calvin to dismiss later developments in Reformed theology. This approach is problematic because it doesn't do justice to the complexity of Reformed thought or to Calvin's own ideas. For example, some have used Calvin's criticisms of speculative theology to argue against the detailed descriptions of divine attributes found in Reformed confessions. This is a misinterpretation because Calvin himself would not have disagreed with these confessional formulations. Similarly, some have dismissed the Reformed Confession's statements about natural revelation, claiming that Calvin did not support such ideas. This is historically inaccurate and ignores the broader context in which Calvin's ideas were developed and applied. In the end, the reassessment of Reformed orthodoxy involves recognizing the diversity and complexity of the Reformed tradition. It means acknowledging that Calvin was one of many important figures in this tradition, and that his ideas were part of a larger, evolving conversation. It also means understanding that the relationship between faith and reason in Reformed thought was not a step toward rationalism, but rather a balanced approach that saw revelation as foundation and reason as a tool for understanding and defending the faith. By avoiding the oversimplifications and distortions associated with the Mueller thesis, we can gain a more accurate and nuanced understanding of Reformed theology and its development over time. This approach allows us to appreciate the richness and depth of the Reformed tradition and to see how it has continued to evolve and adapt to new challenges and contexts. When we talk about the Reformed tradition, we're discussing a branch of Protestant Christianity that emerged during the Reformation in the 16th century. This tradition is often closely linked with the teachings of John Calvin, a French theologian who wrote extensively on Christian doctrine. However, the story of Reformed theology is much richer and more complex than just the ideas of one person. Reformed theology didn't spring fully formed from Calvin's mind. Instead, it evolved over time, influenced by many thinkers and shaped by various contexts. Some of these thinkers, like Ulrich Zwingli, Martin Bucer, and Heinrich Bullinger, were contemporaries of Calvin and contributed significantly to the development of Reformed ideas. Later, other theologians continued to build on and sometimes modify these ideas. One of the key challenges in studying Reformed theology is understanding how it changed over time. Some people argue that there was a radical break between Calvin's ideas and those of later Reformed thinkers, often called Calvinists. This view, known as the Calvin against the Calvinists theory, suggests that later thinkers distorted Calvin's original teachings. However, this perspective is too simplistic. In reality, the Reformed tradition shows both continuity and change. There are clear connections between Calvin's ideas and those of later thinkers, but there are also important differences. These differences often arose because later theologians were responding to new questions and challenges in their own contexts. Context is crucial in understanding Reformed theology. For example, the debates about predestination, the idea that God has already decided who will be saved, became more detailed and nuanced in the 17th century. The terms infralapsarian and supralapsarian were used to describe different views on the order of God's decrees. Infralapsarians believed that God's decision to elect some people to salvation came after the fall of humanity, while supralapsarians believed it came before. These debates were influenced by the specific issues and concerns of the time. For instance, the Synod of Dort in 1618 to 1619 addressed the teachings of Jacob Arminius, who had proposed a different view of predestination. The Synod's decisions shaped the direction of Reformed thought for generations to come. Another important issue in Reformed theology is the question of free will. Calvin himself emphasized human inability in sin, but later Reformed thinkers delved deeper into the broader question of human freedom. They drew on medieval ideas, particularly from Thomas Aquinas and John Duns Scotus, to develop their arguments. Some later, Reformed thinkers like Franciscus Junius and Gisbertus Voetius argued that God's predestination is both gracious and consistent with human free choice and responsibility. This was a way to affirm that salvation is by grace alone, while also addressing the complexities of human freedom. The doctrine of atonement, or how Christ's death on the cross saves people, is another area where Reformed theology has seen both continuity and change. Some argue that Calvin taught limited atonement, meaning that Christ died only for the elect, those God has chosen to save. Others claim he taught universal atonement, meaning Christ's death was sufficient for all people, but effective only for the elect. The term hypothetical universalism emerged in the 17th century to describe a view that Christ's death was sufficient for all, but God's intention was to save only the elect. This view was a way to reconcile the infinite merit of Christ's death with the idea of particular redemption. The Reformed tradition is also marked by a strong confessional movement. Confessions and catechisms, such as the Heidelberg Catechism and the Westminster Confession of Faith, provided a framework for Reformed beliefs. These documents were not meant to be rigid dogmatic systems, but rather broad statements of doctrine that allowed for some diversity in interpretation. The confessional movement emphasized the collective wisdom of the Reformers and the importance of tradition. While Calvin's influence was significant, the Reformed tradition was never defined solely by his teachings. Instead, it was shaped by a community of thinkers who built on and sometimes challenged each other's ideas. Understanding the development of Reformed theology requires recognizing both the continuities and the changes that have occurred over time. It's a story of a vibrant and dynamic tradition that has adapted to new contexts while maintaining core beliefs. By exploring this rich history, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the complexity and depth of Reformed thought. When we talk about whether John Calvin was a Calvinist, we're diving into a complex and sometimes confusing topic. The term Calvinist can mean different things to different people, and that's why the answer to this question isn't straightforward. Let's break it down a bit. First, some people use Calvinist to describe Calvin's own beliefs. If we use this definition, then yes, Calvin was definitely a Calvinist. He wrote extensively about his views on predestination, the nature of God, and the role of Christ in salvation. These ideas are often what people think of when they hear the term Calvinism. But this approach has a big problem. It leaves Calvin as the only true Calvinist. No one else could ever match his exact thoughts and ideas. Another way to use the term Calvinist is to describe people who followed and built upon Calvin's teachings. This is a more common usage. If we use this definition, then Calvin was still a Calvinist, but so were many others who came after him. These followers, like Theodore Beza, Francis Turretin, and John Owen, took Calvin's ideas and developed them further. They didn't always agree with every detail of Calvin's teachings, but they shared a core set of beliefs that traced back to him. However, there's a third way to use the term Calvinist, and it's a bit more complicated. Some people use Calvinist to describe the entire Reformed tradition, which includes a wide range of theologians and churches that share a common heritage. If we use this definition, then Calvin was a Calvinist. But so were many other reformers like Huldrych, Zwingli, Martin Bucer, and Heinrich Bullinger. This approach recognizes that the Reformed tradition is a diverse and evolving body of thought, and Calvin was just one important figure in it. The problem with the first approach is that it makes Calvin the only true Calvinist, which doesn't make much sense. It also tends to ignore the fact that Calvin's ideas were part of a broader conversation among reformers. Calvin didn't create his theology in a vacuum. He was influenced by and interacted with other thinkers of his time. The second approach is more realistic because it acknowledges that Calvin's followers built on and sometimes modified his ideas. This is a natural part of how ideas develop over time. For example, Theodore Beza, who was one of Calvin's closest students, had a slightly different understanding of predestination than Calvin did. But both were still considered Calvinists because they shared a core set of beliefs. The third approach is the most inclusive and historically accurate. It recognizes that the Reformed tradition is a rich and varied tapestry of ideas and beliefs. Calvin was a key figure in this tradition, but he was not the only one. Other reformers like Zwingli and Bucer also contributed significantly to the development of Reformed theology. This approach helps us understand that the Reformed tradition is a living, evolving tradition, not a static set of beliefs. When we ask if Calvin was a Calvinist, we need to be clear about what we mean by Calvinist. If we mean someone who exactly matches Calvin's ideas, then the answer is yes, but only Calvin fits that description. If we mean someone who follows and builds upon Calvin's teachings, then Calvin was a Calvinist, along with many others. If we mean someone who is part of the broader Reformed tradition, then Calvin was a Calvinist, and so were many other reformers. The real question, then, is not whether Calvin was a Calvinist, but how his ideas fit into the larger context of Reformed theology. Calvin's teachings were influential, but they were also part of a larger conversation that continued to evolve after his death. Understanding this context helps us appreciate the richness and diversity of the Reformed tradition. As we wrap up our exploration, it's clear that the question, was Calvin a Calvinist, is more complex than it might seem at first glance. To understand this, we need to look at Calvin and the people who came after him, often called Calvinists, in a broader historical and theological context. First, let's talk about Calvin himself. John Calvin was a key figure in the Reformation, but he wasn't the only one. He worked alongside and was influenced by other reformers like Martin Bucer, Heinrich Bullinger, and Peter Martyr Vermigli. These men, along with many others, contributed to the development of what we now call Reformed theology. Calvin's ideas were important, but they weren't unique in the way that some people think. For example, his views on predestination, the Lord's Supper, and Christ's role in salvation were similar to those of his contemporaries. Calvin didn't just invent these ideas. He built on the work of others and adapted existing teachings to fit his own context. Now, when we talk about Calvinism, we often think of a specific set of beliefs, like the 5 points, summarized by the acronym TULIP: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. The canons of Dort, where these points come from, were written long after Calvin's time, in response to specific theological debates in the Netherlands. They weren't meant to be a comprehensive summary of Reformed theology, but rather a defense against certain ideas that were seen as problematic. The term Calvinist itself is a bit tricky. Calvin himself didn't like the term, and saw his work as part of a broader Catholic, universally Christian tradition. Many of the people who followed him, like Theodore Beza and William Perkins, didn't call themselves Calvinists either. They saw themselves as part of the Reformed tradition, which was a broader movement that included various thinkers and ideas. So, when we ask if Calvin was a Calvinist, we're really asking if he was a follower of his own ideas. But that doesn't make much sense, because no one can be their own follower. Calvin's work was part of a larger conversation among reformers, and the people who came after him built on and adapted his ideas in different ways. In the end, it's more helpful to think of Calvin as a significant figure in the Reformed tradition, rather than as the sole founder of a specific set of beliefs. The Reformed tradition is rich and diverse, with many voices and perspectives. Calvin's contributions were important, but they were part of a larger, ongoing dialogue about faith and theology. By understanding Calvin and the Reformed tradition in this way, we can appreciate the complexity and richness of the ideas that have shaped the Reformed churches over the centuries. This broader perspective helps us see that the Reformed tradition is more than just a set of rigid doctrines. It's a living, dynamic movement that continues to evolve and grow.